brazen and violent.
In a daring move, a victim refuses to back down.
My jaw dropped.
He realizes, I gotta get out of here.
A man armed with an assault rifle.
A brave security guard prevents disaster.
Instead of running away, he runs right into the mix.
I couldn't believe what was happening.
What a nightmare it has been for this family.
Arsonists with gas cans on a rampage.
All masked, covered up. Is this revenge? Jilted lover? What is this?
And a crossing guard becomes a hero.
Risking her own life.
She's never had a car get that close.
I just remember pushing her.
Disturbing videos we can't stop watching. A bold daylight robbery.
It's really difficult to watch.
Turns into a fight for survival.
Obviously, there's some bravery here, there's some courage, but also I think about how easily good days can turn bad. You see this white Tesla pull into the parking lot. The driver parks his vehicle, but almost immediately after that, you have a silver Infiniti pull into the parking lot as well behind them.
What happens next is very chaotic and happens so quickly.
So at this point, the victim, the driver of the Tesla, decides to act. He's not going to be a victim. He engages with the suspect.
This Tesla driver is not going down without a fight.
The victim doesn't hesitate, even with a gun pointed right at him.
And at that point, he realizes, I got to get out of here, and he proceeds to run off camera while the suspect follows him.
As the two men run out of view, pay attention to what happens next.
Now, it seems like this is a tag team effort from the robbers, but I don't really know how much of a team this is.
Seconds later, the gunman reappears.
We don't see what happens off camera, but clearly a fight ensues because when the suspect comes back on camera, he's missing his shirt.
And it seems this parking lot standoff is only the beginning.
The victim is able to break away from this assailant, trying to get to safety, but unfortunately for him, the assailant gets back in his car, picks her up, and then suddenly the moment of this collision, my jaw dropped.
And if you notice in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, as the victim is hit by the Infiniti, he goes up into the air, but also if you look, you can see that the firearm the suspect originally had has flown in the air and landed on the ground in the bottom right-hand corner. What this tells me is that while the individuals were off camera, the victim disarms the suspect.
But the attacker doesn't even seem to realize his gun was left behind.
What's really crazy is, at this point, after striking the victim, the suspect exits his vehicle and tries to rob the victim again. He's still fighting back.
This victim is so impressive because he literally is on the ground after being thrown through the air and is putting up a fight. I can't imagine ever doing that. I can't imagine anyone doing that, but he is.
Incredibly, even after a man tries to rob him, then plows right into him with his car, this victim still fights back.
Eventually, the suspect realizes this guy is refusing to be a victim. He gives up, he hops back in his vehicle, and he takes off.
Police arrive and the victim is rushed to the hospital and treated for non-life-threatening injuries.
I'm glad to see the victim is okay. The situation could have been a lot worse. I'm very impressed by his courage to fight back.
By the next day, the footage is everywhere.
Brazen and violent. That robbery took place in this parking lot, and it was all captured on security video.
The West Hollywood mayor even uses Instagram to plead for help.
We need to work together with our sheriffs to ensure that they have what they need to solve this and other crimes.
And unfortunately, this assailant is still out there. No one was able to find anything on him because he was able to get away. And of course, all attention on the victim to try to help him out because he was, thrown through the air.
It's very apparent that this suspect has an absolute disregard for human life. He has one mission and one mission only, and that's to take whatever he can from this victim. Fortunately for him, he faced someone that refused to be a victim. If the suspect is caught, he's looking at a plethora of charges: robbery, attempted murder. He could be going away for a very long time.
And what remains unclear is why the victim was targeted in the first place.
My feeling right now is that the robber was following this victim from somewhere, the way that they pulled in right behind him in this parking lot.
When you have a routine, you can sometimes get complacent. They're looking for victims of opportunity, and if that may be their sign to take advantage of you.
But there is one takeaway from this viral video.
No car, no amount of money, no item is worth your life. So if you're faced with a situation where someone approaches you with a firearm, if they want a car, give them the keys. If they want your wallet, give it to them. Again, those items can be replaced. Your life can't.
From one intense robbery to another.
In a tense scene, a man armed with an assault rifle. Heroic actions of a security guard.
Multiple people could have been killed.
Here, a quiet morning turns to chaos inside a drug rehab clinic.
A man comes inside with a high-powered rifle.
At first, the staff members inside the lobby don't notice the gun.
There's a security guard who's standing there next to a window.
The guard is the man wearing a mask in the middle of the screen. He has a jacket over his uniform.
The security guard is clearly startled.
It's important to note that this security guard is unarmed.
Typically, security guards are not trained to disarm an armed suspect. If they were, then they would be armed themselves.
With no hesitation, Reynaldo Beckford risks his own life.
Instead of running away, he runs right into the mix. His actions are heroic. Anytime there's any type of gun involved, it's a high-stakes situation.
But this isn't just any gun. It's an automatic rifle, capable of firing multiple shots at once.
If you look at the left of your screen, you can see the men struggling. The security guard is trying to wrestle this gun away.
Now, about 20 seconds into the struggle over this AR-15, a second security guard assists in apprehending the suspect.
The gun goes off again, 2 more times during the struggle. Thankfully, no one was hurt.
Worst scenario, he would have continued to fire shots throughout the clinic. And multiple people could have been shot, injured, or killed.
While someone in the clinic dials 911, the 2 security guards manage to force the gunman out the door. Stunned, a man parked outside begins filming on his cell phone. And it turns out, these aren't the only shots this criminal has fired that morning. The security guards hold the gunman down until police arrive. He is identified as 48-year-old Jeremy Griffin.
The same suspect was linked to another shooting that happened prior to this incident.
The frightening story dominates the local news.
Police say that clinic was one of 2 sites the same man fired shots at within a few minutes of each other.
A Buffalo man faces a long list of charges after police say he shot a woman in the leg and then opened fire at a Lower West Side methadone clinic.
Corner of my eyes, all I saw was the person and the rifle. And I couldn't believe what was happening. I had him and I had the rifle. I was just saying, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus.
Footage of the struggle goes viral, and praise for Reynaldo pours in.
One person said, "Give that man a raise," commending his actions. And so there seems to be a lot of support for the unarmed security guard.
The woman Griffin shot before storming into the clinic is treated for non-life-threatening injuries. And Griffin is indicted on 5 felony counts, including attempted murder. The motive for both shootings turns out to be the same.
By all accounts of our investigation, we believe this was an attempted robbery seeking drugs.
The security officer was very brave and courageous in his actions, not being trained, but knowing the danger that could come upon this agency or this clinic if he did not disarm them was absolutely bravery.
He prevented someone from getting killed that day.
When he talks to news reporters, Reynaldo says he doesn't consider himself a hero.
That's the business that I'm in, to save and protect. And that's exactly what I did. Nobody lost their life. Nobody got hurt.
But even if no one ends up seriously hurt, being attacked out of nowhere is always terrifying.
This really feels like a crime of passion or a crime of vengeance.
One of them is fully engulfed in flames.
Devastating arsons.
I was shocked. I was in disbelief.
That take a personal toll.
This happens right in front of this family's house.
Shortly after 2 a.m., a car alarm blares outside a suburban home. Rushing to the window, a young father sees the family's car engulfed in flames.
It's the car alarm and the sound of the fire which wakes this family up. What they do is they want to protect their children and their families and themselves as much as possible, so they move to another area of the house.
They call 911 and the fire department quickly arrives to extinguish the blaze. But the biggest shock is revealed on the family's home security camera.
When you see this person coming up, all masked, you know that they don't want to be identified.
After throwing a gas can into one of the cars, the masked arsonist escapes into an idling getaway car driven by an accomplice.
Who is this fire starter? Why are they doing this?
This happens right in front of this family's house. Not just one vehicle, but a second vehicle.
The story hits the local news.
What a nightmare it has been for this family. They say they are still on edge.
A homeowner in Corona is living in fear after someone set a parked car on fire near his home.
And explodes online. Is this a random attack, or is it targeted?
You have to think, is this revenge? Jilted lover? What is this?
This family is lucky in the sense that the fire did not spread to another home, to their home, to other vehicles. That car alarm really saved the night.
Police are not revealing any details about the ongoing investigation and are asking for the public's help to solve the case.
I spoke to the Corona Fire Investigations Unit. Everyone out there could watch this video, zone in on the suspects who are seen on this tape. And if you have any information at all, please pick up the phone and call the Corona Police Department directly.
It's possible this is the work of a serial arsonist. Earlier that year, and just 1 hour away, another family is victim to an almost identical crime.
A guy pulls up to a parking lot and sets fire to all of the cars.
Again armed with a gas can, this man torches car after car parked in front of an apartment building.
One of the people who lives at this building is watching this unfold on a Ring camera, and she immediately alerts her father, who's inside the building, and they spring into action.
As cars go up in flames, a woman and her father desperately try to contain the damage.
They're grabbing hoses to try to put out the fires. It's really dangerous.
She is alerting residents, and he's moving outside. At one point, you even see this man with a fire extinguisher going after these flames and trying to put this fire out. One of the worst case scenarios is that the building could have caught fire.
Police still don't know who this guy is.
The bold crime blazes across news screens and the internet.
I mean, what possibly do you have to gain by doing something like this? Is it to instill fear? Is it to watch the incident unfold? We don't know if this attack was personal.
This arson also remains unsolved, but there is one clue.
Police say that the suspect could be someone in that community.
Still, these incendiary crimes are baffling.
The person committing the arson is getting nothing out of this. There's no reward, no financial reward, no monetary reward at all. So it has to feel just good, which is what's so creepy about it.
And usually when people do things with no reward, it's because they are selfless heroes. Here, an everyday morning routine takes a frightening turn.
Risking her own life to save a middle school student.
At this point, I'm sure she's thinking, I need to save this child's life.
What we're looking at right now just seems like a typical day near a school. It's footage from a bus of a crossing guard, Corporal Annette Goodyear, guiding kids to cross the street.
Been doing it for 14 years. I was doing the morning detail. It was a rainy, misty day. So I made sure I put on my rain gear with my rain hat because we knew rain was coming in that day. I had already stopped traffic a couple of times letting children cross the street. I saw the young lady coming to the crosswalk. I stopped traffic coming in the one direction, looked down the street in the opposite direction.
As she's performing her duties, she puts her hand up to make sure that the children are crossing safely.
At that point, I decided after no traffic was coming to just have a conversation with the girl as she's passing by me.
But that's when she notices something.
So I'm turning, and out of the corner of my eye, I could see this vehicle coming at us.
In that split second, Annette throws the girl to safety and takes the brunt of the hit from the car.
I just remember pushing her, and then the next thing I know, the car is clipping me in the knees. I'm going up on the hood of the car, and I'm rolling off onto the ground. It just seemed very slow-mo. It was just very strange.
Cannot even imagine what she's feeling.
I remember lifting my head up, looking for the child to make sure that the child wasn't hurt in any way. I saw her standing up. Once I realized she was able to stand up, I just laid my head back on the ground.
Miraculously, the young girl is unharmed.
She just kind of started looking back and forth from me to the school, like she didn't know what she should do at that point. She was in shock.
The driver of the car is also shocked by the accident.
I could hear the car door close, and I could see her run around, and she's like, sorry, I didn't see you. And I was like, ma'am, please don't say anything at this point.
Now, the driver says that she did not see her. That is possible, but we all know that our minds are pulled in another direction when we're driving. Cell phones, traffic, and it is rainy weather.
But I mean, in a bright colored poncho in the middle of a street, I don't really know how much I believe that.
There's no way they could not have saw me. I'm in a huge orange raincoat. It's like a traffic cone. At that point, I'm noticeable. It's not like I'm just standing there wearing all black and nobody's gonna see you.
A few moments later, help arrives and Corporal Goodyear is rushed to the hospital.
So it was just basically just going through any other thing at the hospital. You make sure nothing's broken.
But Corporal Goodyear isn't thinking about herself.
She is in the hospital that night, and right when she is released, she goes to the kid's home to make sure the kid is feeling okay and doing all right. What a saint.
That in itself shows the character of Corporal Goodyear.
I'm here at this crossing guard area to make sure these kids get across to school safely and home safely. So it's just what we're supposed to do. And it just seemed second nature at that point to make sure that she was safe. Her little sister had made this little flowering pot that she gave me. I was trying not to cry. The students started getting teary-eyed, and I'm just like trying to hold it in. It just made me feel more closer to the students that I really love dealing and working with every single day.
Her heroism makes the local news.
And Corporal Goodyear tells us in her almost 15 years of being a cross guard, she's never had a car get that close to the crosswalk.
A few days later, the superintendent of the local school district praises her on Twitter. She also accepts the Maryland Governor's Award.
Well, just days after being hit by a car, a police officer working as a crossing guard is honored and back on the job.
I kind of felt that I didn't deserve it. It's not why we do this job. You do this job to just make everyone feel safe.
Corporal Goodyear put her life on the line. She wouldn't say this, but this makes her a hero.
The driver is charged with multiple traffic citations and ordered to pay a fine. And everyone is relieved that the accident wasn't worse.
Watching this video, I was just terrified that something like this could happen at a school when there's so many kids around. But then it's so good to know that there are heroes walking around every day.
Cirelli was only 4 years old when his life ended. For 65 years, however, no one outside a small circle of investigators even knew his name. He was known instead by another title, one that echoed through newspapers, police stations, and true crime history alike, the boy in the box. It was a name born not from identity, but from absence. It reflected a child who seemed to have vanished before anyone realized he had existed. No family publicly searched for him. No school reported him missing. No neighbor recognized his face. No birthday records led detectives to his home. For more than 6 decades, America knew almost everything about the injuries that ended his life, yet almost nothing about the life that had come before them. His story became one of the nation's oldest unsolved child murder cases, not simply because investigators could not identify a killer, but because they could not even answer the most basic question every victim deserves: who was he? The answer would not arrive until December 2022, when advances in genetic genealogy finally restored his name to history. But restoring a name is not the same as delivering justice. Today, the murder of Joseph Augustus Cirelli remains unsolved, leaving behind questions that continue to haunt investigators, historians, and everyone who has encountered his story. To understand why this case became one of America's most enduring mysteries, it is necessary to return to Philadelphia in the winter of 1957. At the time, Philadelphia stood as the third largest city in the United States, home to more than 2 million people. It was a city shaped by decades of industrial growth, neighborhoods filled with working families, expanding suburbs, and a population adjusting to the social changes that followed the Second World War. Crime rates had increased in many American cities during the post-war years, and police departments were confronting new challenges brought by rapid urban expansion. Even so, murders involving young children remained deeply unsettling and relatively uncommon. When they did occur, they attracted enormous public attention because they violated one of society's most basic expectations: that children should be protected. In 1957, forensic science looked very different from the techniques investigators rely on today. DNA analysis did not exist. Computer databases were decades away. Fingerprint comparisons depended upon manual examination. Missing person investigations relied heavily on paper records, telephone calls, newspaper coverage, and cooperation between police departments. Every lead required painstaking human effort. Every comparison took time. Every mistake could send detectives down weeks or months of fruitless investigation. It was an era in which a determined investigator could solve remarkable crimes through persistence alone. Yet it was also an era in which someone without records, documentation, or relatives could effectively disappear. That reality would define this case from its earliest hours. Beyond Philadelphia's busy neighborhoods lay quieter areas where suburban development had not yet replaced fields and woodland. One such place was Fox Chase, located in the northeastern section of the city. In the 1950s, Fox Chase presented a striking contrast to downtown Philadelphia. Sections of the area remained rural, with patches of woodland, open grass, narrow roads, and scattered homes separated by stretches of undeveloped land. Susquehanna Road wound through portions of this landscape, bordered in places by brush, trees, and uneven terrain. During daylight hours, local residents occasionally traveled these roads, but many sections remained relatively isolated. Someone familiar with the area would have understood that certain spots could remain undisturbed for extended periods, especially during the cold weeks of late February. It was here, along one of these quiet roads, that one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries would begin. On the morning of February 25, 1957. A young student from La Salle University entered the wooded area near Susquehanna Road for an entirely unrelated reason. He was checking muskrat traps that had been placed nearby. As he moved through the brush, something unusual caught his attention. Resting among the vegetation, only a short distance from the roadside, sat a large cardboard box. At first glance, there was nothing particularly remarkable about discarded packaging. Illegal dumping occurred often enough that abandoned household items rarely attracted immediate concern. The student observed the box, but chose not to investigate further. The area included restrictions against certain activities, and he feared that if he approached authorities, he might instead face uncomfortable questions about why he had been there. Deciding it was safer to leave, he walked away without opening the box or contacting police. Years later, that decision would become one of the most discussed moments in the history of the investigation. According to later accounts, he regretted not reporting what he had seen sooner, although there was no way of knowing whether an earlier discovery could have altered the outcome of the investigation. The following day, February 26th, another man entered the same general area while searching for a route to exercise his hunting dog. Like the student before him, he noticed the cardboard box positioned near the roadside. Unlike the first witness, however, curiosity led him closer. As he approached, he realized the box appeared large enough to contain something substantial. He opened it. Inside, carefully placed within the cardboard container, lay the body of a small boy. The child had been wrapped in an old plaid blanket and positioned inside what investigators would later determine had once been a cardboard shipping box for a baby bassinet. The discovery was shocking not only because a child had been abandoned in such a place, but because there was nothing else inside that could explain who he was. There were no clothes, no identificación, no personal belongings, no toys, nothing that could provide investigators with even the smallest glimpse into the child's identity or where he had come from. Police officers from the Philadelphia Police Department arrived quickly after receiving the report. The area surrounding the box was secured while detectives and crime scene investigators began documenting every visible detail. The location itself offered little assistance. Investigators found no witnesses who had observed anyone abandoning the box. They found no obvious footprints that could reliably identify a suspect. No clear tire tracks remained that could establish what vehicle had transported the body. The scene appeared almost deliberately empty, as though whoever had left the child there had chosen both the place and the timing carefully enough to avoid detection. Yet the absence of evidence would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. Even during those earliest hours, experienced detectives understood they were facing an investigation unlike most homicide cases. Normally, identifying a victim serves as the first major step toward identifying a suspect. Family members, friends, employers, neighbors, schools, or doctors all become potential sources of information. A victim's daily routine often reveals who last saw them alive and who might have wished them harm. In this investigation, however, detectives possessed only the body of an unidentified child. They did not know his name, his family, his home, or even the community where he had lived. Before they could search for a murderer, they first had to discover the identity of the victim himself. That challenge would soon grow even more disturbing. As investigators carefully examined the little boy, they realized he had not simply died under mysterious circumstances. His body displayed signs suggesting a difficult life long before his final moments. The child appeared to be between 4 and 6 years old. He measured approximately 1 meter in height and weighed only around 13 kilograms, noticeably underweight for a boy of that age. He had brown hair, blue eyes, and fair skin. His hair had been cut very recently, close to the scalp. His fingernails had also been neatly trimmed. At first glance, these details suggested someone had cared enough to clean his appearance shortly before his death or shortly afterward. Yet other observations painted a far darker picture. Detectives and medical personnel noted that the child bore numerous injuries, both old and new, indicating that whatever had happened during the final hours of his life might not have been an isolated act of violence. Standing beside that lonely road in Fox Chase, investigators could not yet know that this unknown little boy would remain nameless for more than 6 decades. They could not know that generations of detectives would inherit the same case file, each hoping to solve the mystery that had defeated those before them. And they certainly could not imagine that only technology unavailable in 1957 would eventually restore the child's identity. But on that cold February morning, one truth had already become painfully clear. Somewhere a little boy had lived, suffered, and died. Someone knew exactly who he was. Someone knew exactly what had happened. And despite the silence surrounding the lonely cardboard box beside Susquehanna Road, the search for those answers had only just begun. The investigation moved forward almost immediately, but from the very beginning, detectives faced a problem unlike any they had encountered before. Every homicide investigation depends on a starting point. Usually, that starting point is the victim's identity. Investigators ask who the victim was, where they lived, who last saw them, what relationships they had, and whether anyone had reason to harm them. In this case, none of those questions could be answered. The child lying inside the cardboard bassinet box had no name, no known address, and no apparent connection to anyone willing or able to identify him. Instead of searching for a killer through the victim's life, detectives first had to reconstruct that life from the physical evidence left behind. The examination of the crime scene itself produced only a handful of clues, and none immediately pointed toward a suspect. The cardboard container attracted particular attention. Detectives determined that it had originally been used to package a baby bassinet sold through J.C. Penney. Although it was an ordinary commercial product, investigators believed every object associated with the body deserved careful scrutiny. They examined markings on the box, identifying production information that allowed them to trace its path through manufacturing and distribution. The investigation followed the shipment from the factory to warehouses and eventually to a J.C. Penney store serving the Philadelphia area. At first, this appeared promising. If detectives could identify who had purchased the bassinet, perhaps they would uncover the household connected to the child. Unfortunately, retail practices in the 1950s offered little assistance. Purchases of common household goods were generally not linked to customer identities in a way that investigators could later review. By the time detectives reached the end of the supply chain, they discovered that the trail simply ended at the store. The identity of the buyer remained unknown. The bassinet box, which had initially appeared to be one of the strongest pieces of evidence, became another dead end. Attention then shifted to the blanket wrapped around the child's body. It was an old plaid blanket, worn from use but otherwise unremarkable. Specialists examined its fabric, weave, and manufacturing characteristics, hoping that it might represent a distinctive regional product or a limited production item. Instead, their findings suggested precisely the opposite. The blanket appeared to be a mass-produced household item commonly available throughout the Eastern United States. There were no identifying labels that survived, no repairs unique enough to trace to a particular owner, and no unusual characteristics that could narrow the search. Once again, investigators found themselves holding evidence that confirmed only how ordinary the object was. Like the cardboard box, the blanket refused to reveal anything about the child or the person who had placed him there. Detectives also searched carefully for fingerprints. Every accessible surface associated with the body and the surrounding area underwent examination. Yet the results proved equally disappointing. Any fingerprints recovered were either too faint to be useful or belonged to individuals involved in discovering or processing the scene. No identifiable print connected investigators to a suspect. Without DNA technology, fingerprint evidence represented one of the strongest forms of physical identification available during that era. The inability to recover usable prints deprived investigators of another important investigative avenue. As attention shifted from the physical evidence to the victim himself, The medical examination began providing a clearer picture of the child's condition. Although the autopsy could not reveal his identity, it offered crucial insight into the life he had experienced before his death. Physicians estimated the boy to be between 4 and 6 years old. He stood approximately 1 meter tall and weighed only about 13 kilograms, a weight considered significantly below expectations for a healthy child of his estimated age. The finding immediately raised concerns about long-term nutrition. Malnutrition alone could not explain everything investigators observed, but it suggested that the child might not have received consistent care. His appearance presented a troubling contrast. While his body reflected signs of neglect, other details suggested recent attention. His brown hair had been cut very close to the scalp, appearing freshly trimmed. His fingernails had also been neatly cut. These observations stood in sharp contrast to the injuries visible across his body. Investigators documented numerous bruises in different stages of healing. Some appeared relatively recent, while others were older. Small scars marked areas including his chin, ankle, and groin. Certain injuries had already begun healing days or even weeks before his death. Collectively, these findings suggested that the violence inflicted upon him had not been confined to a single incident. Instead, detectives considered the possibility that the child had experienced repeated physical abuse over an extended period. The most devastating injury involved his head. Medical examiners concluded that the boy had suffered severe blunt force trauma, resulting in a significant skull fracture. This injury was determined to be the primary cause of death. Investigators could not identify the exact object responsible. It may have been caused by a heavy blunt instrument or by the child's head striking a hard surface with considerable force. The available evidence did not allow doctors to distinguish between those possibilities. What they could state with confidence was that the injury was catastrophic and ultimately fatal. At the same time, the examination ruled out several other possibilities. There was no evidence of gunshot wounds. No stab wounds were identified. There was no indication that the child had drowned. Likewise, investigators reported no confirmed evidence of sexual assault during the examination. These conclusions helped narrow certain investigative theories while leaving countless others unresolved. Perhaps one of the most puzzling observations involved the condition of the child's body. Despite the obvious injuries and signs of prolonged hardship, detectives believed the body had likely been washed before it was abandoned. Combined with the freshly cut hair and trimmed fingernails, this created an unsettling contradiction. Someone had apparently taken time to clean the child shortly before or after death. Investigators did not treat this as proof of affection or remorse. Instead, they considered the possibility that whoever handled the body either wished to remove physical evidence or knew the child personally enough to prepare him before disposal. The available evidence could not establish motive, and detectives remained careful not to draw conclusions unsupported by facts. Nevertheless, the condition of the body strengthened the belief that the offender may have been someone familiar with the victim rather than a stranger selected at random. As detectives assembled these findings, one fact became increasingly difficult to ignore. Every physical characteristic of the child suggested that someone should have recognized him. He was not an infant whose appearance changed rapidly over weeks. He was old enough to walk, speak, and interact with others. A 4 to 6-year-old child normally leaves traces within a community. Neighbors notice him playing outside. Teachers recognize his face. Doctors maintain medical records. Relatives celebrate birthdays. Friends remember conversations. Yet as investigators compared the boy's description against local reports, nothing matched. The realization prompted one of the largest identification efforts Philadelphia had ever undertaken. For an unidentified child, detectives refused to believe that a child of this age could simply exist without anyone noticing his disappearance. They distributed descriptions to police departments, hospitals, schools, and organizations responsible for child welfare. Every missing child report received renewed attention. Investigators searched adoption records, reviewed orphanage information, and attempted to identify any family whose son resembled the victim. As the days became weeks, the search expanded far beyond Philadelphia itself. The case began receiving extensive media attention. Newspapers published descriptions of the child. Radio broadcasts appealed directly to listeners. Photographs reached communities throughout the region. Authorities hoped that someone would recognize the little boy's face and finally provide investigators with the first real lead. Instead, something almost unimaginable occurred. The appeals produced no identification. No family stepped forward. No parent reported a missing son matching the description. No teacher contacted police after recognizing a former student. No doctor claimed to have treated him. Every expectation investigators held, that someone somewhere must surely know this child, collapsed under the weight of complete silence. The absence of recognition gradually transformed the investigation itself. Detectives were no longer searching only for a murderer. They were searching for evidence that the victim had ever been part of an ordinary life at all. That silence would become one of the greatest mysteries surrounding the case. A mystery almost as haunting as the murder itself, and one that would continue to frustrate investigators for decades to come. As weeks turned into months, investigators reached a troubling conclusion that fundamentally changed the direction of the case. The greatest obstacle was no longer the lack of physical evidence or the absence of eyewitnesses. Instead, it was the complete failure to identify the child. Detectives believed that solving the murder depended first on restoring the victim's identity. Because every child belongs somewhere. Every child has a family, neighbors, acquaintances, or people who have seen them grow. Even if parents refuse to cooperate, someone else should have noticed the disappearance of a 4 to 6-year-old boy. Yet every traditional investigative method continued to produce the same unsettling result. No one seemed to know who he was. Faced with this unprecedented challenge, the Philadelphia Police Department launched what became one of the largest identification campaigns for an unknown child in the city's history. More than 400,000 flyers bearing the boy's description and photograph were printed and distributed throughout Philadelphia and beyond. Detectives understood that if they could not identify him through official records, perhaps an ordinary citizen would recognize his face. The flyers appeared in neighborhoods, public buildings, businesses, schools, and police stations. Officers carried copies while conducting interviews. Newspapers printed photographs of the child, while radio and television broadcasts urged the public to come forward with any information. No matter how insignificant it seemed, the investigation expanded well beyond city limits. Information was shared with police agencies across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. The Federal Bureau of Investigation received case materials. Canadian authorities were also provided with information in case the child had originated outside the United States. Hospitals were contacted to determine whether any young patient matching the victim's physical description had suddenly disappeared. Schools were asked to review attendance records for children who had unexpectedly stopped attending classes. Detectives visited orphanages, children's homes, adoption agencies, and charitable organizations that worked with vulnerable families. They searched through thousands of missing child reports, comparing ages, heights, eye colors, and physical descriptions against the boy found in Fox Chase. Every promising lead was investigated. Every possible match was examined. One by one, each possibility was eliminated. The overwhelming silence surrounding the child's identity soon became one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire investigation. Detectives expected that even if the child's parents had chosen not to report him missing, someone else eventually would. A grandparent might ask questions. A neighbor could notice his absence. A teacher might remember that a student had simply vanished without explanation. Friends, relatives, clergy, or physicians often become unexpected witnesses in missing child investigations. In this case, however, none of those expected connections materialized. No family member arrived at police headquarters searching for a missing son. No relative contacted authorities after recognizing newspaper photographs. No physician identified the child as a former patient. No church congregation reported the unexplained disappearance of a young boy. No school employee recognized him. Even charitable organizations that regularly worked with struggling families could not identify him. Investigators found themselves confronting a possibility that seemed almost impossible to accept. Perhaps the child had lived so isolated from society that almost no one outside his immediate surroundings knew he existed. To increase the chances of recognition, authorities took another extraordinary step. Forensic specialists reconstructed the child's appearance in a manner intended to present him as he might have looked during life rather than in death. Investigators dressed a mannequin in children's clothing and used it as part of the public identification campaign. Additional images were circulated through newspapers and police bulletins. The hope was simple. Someone somewhere would look into those familiar young eyes and remember a little boy who had suddenly disappeared. Once again, the effort failed. Days became months. Months became years. The unidentified child slowly became known by a title that reflected both the mystery and the tragedy surrounding his case. America's Unknown Child. Others simply referred to him as the boy in the box, a name inspired by the cardboard bassinet box in which his body had been discovered. The nickname spread rapidly through newspapers and public discussion, eventually becoming one of the most recognizable case titles in American criminal history. Yet behind the nickname remained an uncomfortable reality. The title described how investigators had found him, but it revealed nothing about who he had actually been. It did not tell the story of his life, only the circumstances under which his body entered history. As the years passed, countless detectives inherited responsibility for the investigation. Personnel changed. Police leadership evolved. New forensic techniques emerged. Yet each new investigator encountered the same nearly empty file that had frustrated those before them. The physical evidence remained limited. The crime scene had yielded little. The victim still had no confirmed identity. Every detective understood that identifying the child remained the single most important objective because without that foundation, establishing motive, reconstructing his final days, or identifying potential suspects became exponentially more difficult. Despite the lack of progress, investigators refused to abandon the case. Periodically, old evidence was re-examined whenever advances in forensic science offered even the slightest possibility of uncovering new information. Among the theories that attracted significant attention over the decades was one that became publicly associated with the pseudonym M or Martha. In 2002, a woman approached investigators with a deeply disturbing account involving her adoptive mother. According to her statement, the woman claimed that her adoptive mother had acquired a young boy from his biological parents. She alleged that the child was kept in the family's basement, isolated from others and subjected to repeated physical abuse. According to her account, the boy lived under harsh conditions and suffered frequent mistreatment. She further claimed that one day the child became ill after eating baked beans and vomited his meal. In response, her adoptive mother allegedly became enraged and struck the boy in the head, causing the fatal injury. The witness then claimed that after the child's death, the body was washed, the hair was cut, and the child was placed inside a cardboard bassinet box before being abandoned. Detectives paid close attention to the account because certain elements appeared to resemble details known only through the investigation. The condition of the body had indeed suggested that it had been cleaned. The child's hair had recently been cut. The use of a cardboard bassinet box also aligned with the crime scene evidence. These similarities caused investigators to examine the claims carefully rather than dismissing them outright. However, an important distinction remained. Similarity is not proof. Despite extensive efforts, investigators were unable to find independent physical evidence capable of confirming the witness's account. The adoptive mother identified in the statement had already died, preventing further questioning. Other aspects of the story could not be corroborated through documents, witnesses, or forensic evidence. As a result, although the information remained part of the investigative record, police never announced it as the official explanation for the crime. It remained exactly what detectives described it as: an unverified theory requiring corroboration that could not be obtained. Other investigators considered a different possibility based upon the remarkable absence of missing person reports. They questioned whether the child had ever been fully integrated into ordinary society. One theory proposed that he may have lived in isolation, separated from schools, neighbors, and institutions that ordinarily notice a child's disappearance. Some suggested he could have been connected to illegal child trafficking or an informal transfer of custody outside official channels. Under this hypothesis, the absence of identification might be explained by the fact that no legitimate records connected the child to those responsible for raising him. Investigators also considered whether prolonged abuse might explain both his physical condition and his apparent invisibility. Nevertheless, these ideas remained investigative theories rather than established facts. No evidence conclusively demonstrated that the child had been trafficked or illegally obtained, and detectives consistently distinguished between possibilities and verified evidence. For decades, this careful distinction guided the investigation. Detectives resisted the temptation to embrace dramatic explanations unsupported by proof. Even as public fascination with the mystery grew, they understood that every unsupported conclusion risked diverting attention from the facts that could eventually solve the case. Despite the frustration of repeated dead ends, investigators continued preserving every available piece of evidence, believing that one day future scientific advances might succeed where traditional investigative methods had failed. That decision, made long before anyone imagined the possibilities of modern genetic genealogy, would eventually become the turning point that transformed one of America's oldest unidentified child cases into a murder investigation with a real name attached to its youngest victim. For decades, the investigation into the boy in the box existed in a strange state between persistence and uncertainty. It was never officially forgotten, yet it continually resisted every attempt to solve it. Detectives retired, new investigators inherited the files, and advances in forensic science gradually transformed criminal investigations across the United States. Cases once considered impossible began to yield answers through fingerprints entered into computerized databases, improved forensic pathology, and eventually DNA analysis. Throughout these decades of scientific progress, the evidence collected in February 1957 remained carefully preserved. Although investigators could not know precisely how future technology would evolve, they understood that evidence lost could never be recovered. Their decision to protect every available sample, document, and photograph would eventually prove to be one of the most important choices made during the life of the investigation. As years became decades, the unidentified child came to symbolize one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. The name America's Unknown Child carried enormous emotional weight because it represented more than a single unsolved murder. It reflected a troubling reality that a young boy had lived, suffered, and died without society ever learning his identity. Every anniversary of the discovery renewed public interest. Newspapers revisited the investigation. Criminal investigators occasionally discussed the case as an example of how difficult homicide investigations could become when the victim remained unidentified. Yet despite renewed attention, no breakthrough arrived. Every promising lead eventually reached the same conclusion. There was still no reliable way to identify the child. Behind the scenes, however, forensic science was entering an entirely new era. DNA technology, which had not existed in 1957, gradually revolutionized criminal investigations around the world. Initially, DNA analysis served primarily to compare biological samples between known individuals and crime scene evidence. Later developments expanded these capabilities dramatically. Eventually, scientists developed techniques capable of tracing family relationships through genetic genealogy, allowing investigators to identify unknown individuals by locating distant biological relatives whose DNA appeared in genealogical databases. This approach had already begun solving other cold cases that traditional investigative methods had failed to resolve. Detectives responsible for the Boy in the Box investigation recognized that the same technology might finally answer the question that had haunted generations of investigators. Who was the little boy found beside Susquehanna Road? In 2019, more than 60 years after the child's death, investigators made the difficult decision to exhume his remains. The purpose was not to reopen old wounds, but to obtain the highest quality DNA samples possible, using modern forensic techniques unavailable during previous examinations. Specialists carefully recovered biological material suitable for advanced analysis. Scientists employed multiple forms of genetic testing, including mitochondrial DNA, nuclear DNA, and genetic genealogy. Each technique contributed different information. Together, they offered investigators their greatest opportunity yet to identify the victim. The process required extraordinary patience. Genetic genealogy does not instantly reveal a person's identity. Instead, it identifies biological relatives, sometimes very distant ones, and gradually constructs family trees by comparing historical records, birth certificates, census information, and documented family relationships. Investigators worked methodically through generations of relatives, narrowing possibilities while verifying each conclusion through documentary evidence. Every potential connection required careful confirmation because accuracy remained essential. The goal was not merely to identify a likely family, but to establish the child's identity beyond reasonable doubt. After years of analysis, verification, and genealogical research, the investigation reached a milestone that had once seemed impossible. On December 8, 2022, the Philadelphia Police Department publicly announced that the child known for generations as the Boy in the Box had finally been identified. His name was Joseph Augustus Cirelli. He had been born on January 13, 1953, in West Philadelphia. The announcement marked the end of one mystery, but not the end of the investigation. For the first time in 65 years, detectives could replace a heartbreaking nickname with a real name. The unknown child finally became Joseph Augustus Cirelli, restoring an identity that history had denied him for more than 6 decades. During the announcement, investigators emphasized an important point that sometimes becomes overlooked in public discussion. Identifying a victim is an extraordinary achievement, but it does not automatically identify the person responsible for the crime. The DNA evidence had answered one question while leaving many others unresolved. Detectives deliberately chose not to publicly identify Joseph's parents or surviving relatives. They explained that members of the biological family were still living and deserved privacy. More importantly, the homicide investigation itself remained active. Publicly releasing additional personal information carried the risk of compromising investigative strategies or unfairly affecting individuals who had not been accused of any crime. Authorities acknowledged that they possessed additional information regarding Joseph's family background, but they declined to disclose details because the case remained open. This careful approach reflected the professionalism that had characterized the investigation. Throughout its history, detectives understood the difference between information known privately and evidence appropriate for public release. While the identification generated worldwide headlines, investigators remained focused on the larger objective, determining exactly how Joseph died and who was responsible. The announcement also prompted renewed examination of long-standing investigative theories. Some observers wondered whether identifying Joseph would immediately confirm one of the earlier hypotheses regarding his life. Yet investigators resisted drawing premature conclusions. The theory involving the woman known publicly as M remained unverified. Although aspects of her account appeared consistent with certain facts of the investigation, no independent evidence emerged proving that her description accurately explained Joseph's death. Likewise, broader theories suggesting child trafficking or prolonged isolation continued to lack definitive proof. Detectives maintained the same position they had held for years. Theories could guide investigative thinking, but they could not replace evidence. Joseph's identification did, however, reinforce one heartbreaking reality. He had not been an anonymous child abandoned without history. He had been born with a name, a birth date, and a biological family. Somewhere between his birth in January 1953 and the discovery of his body in February 1957, something catastrophic had occurred. The identification narrowed the mystery chronologically, but it did not reconstruct those missing years. Investigators still sought answers to fundamental questions. Where had Joseph spent the final months of his life? Who had been responsible for caring for him? Who had witnessed the injuries later documented during the autopsy? Why had no missing person report ever been filed after his disappearance? Perhaps the most haunting question remained unchanged despite the identification. How could a child live for approximately 4 years without anyone outside his immediate surroundings recognizing his disappearance after death? Even after learning Joseph's name, detectives continued confronting the remarkable absence of witnesses. Someone had known him. Someone had almost certainly interacted with him during his lifetime. Someone had either participated in or possessed knowledge about the circumstances leading to his death. Yet despite 65 years of investigation, that silence endured. Authorities also reiterated another critical point. The physical evidence collected in 1957 continued to indicate that Joseph's body had likely been cleaned before being abandoned. His hair had been freshly cut. His fingernails had been trimmed. Those observations remained significant because they suggested deliberate handling of the body before it was placed inside the bassinet box. Investigators continued to believe that whoever prepared Joseph after death may have known him personally. However, they remained careful not to state this possibility as established fact. The available evidence supported the observation that the body had been cleaned, but it did not conclusively establish the relationship between Joseph and the individual responsible. As the world absorbed the news that America's unknown child finally had a name, another realization gradually emerged. Although Joseph Augustus Zarelli had regained his identity, justice had not yet caught up with history. No arrest followed the announcement. No suspect stood before a judge. No courtroom heard testimony explaining what had happened during the final hours of Joseph's life. There would be no trial because investigators still lacked the evidence necessary to identify and prosecute the person responsible. In many criminal investigations, identifying the victim represents the beginning of the search for justice. For Joseph, it represented both an ending and a beginning. One chapter of the mystery had finally closed after 65 years. But the most important chapter, the search for accountability, remained unfinished. Today, the murder of Joseph Augustus Zarelli continues to stand as one of the oldest unsolved homicide cases maintained by the Philadelphia Police Department. Investigators still encourage anyone with relevant information to come forward, believing that even after so many decades, the smallest overlooked detail could help explain how a little boy lost both his life and, for so many years, even his name. The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli in December 2022 marked one of the most significant moments in the history of the investigation. But it did not provide the ending that many had hoped for. Instead, it underscored a painful truth that investigators had understood from the beginning. Knowing who the victim was did not automatically explain how he had spent the final years of his short life, nor did it identify the individual responsible for ending it. In many homicide cases, a victim's identity serves as the key that unlocks every other question. Family members describe the victim's routine. Friends identify recent conflicts. Employers, neighbors, teachers, and relatives help investigators reconstruct the final days before death. Joseph's case remained different. Although detectives finally restored his name, the years between his birth on January 13, 1953, and the discovery of his body in February 1957 were still filled with unanswered questions. Investigators now knew that the little boy found inside the cardboard bassinet box had entered the world with a birth certificate and a family name. They also knew that both of his biological parents had since died and that he had surviving siblings. However, authorities deliberately chose not to release additional identifying information regarding his relatives. The decision was not made to create further mystery, but to protect the privacy of living family members and preserve the integrity of an active homicide investigation. Police acknowledged that they possessed information they could not yet discuss publicly, emphasizing that disclosure without sufficient evidence could damage the investigation or unfairly implicate individuals who had never been charged with a crime. This careful balance between transparency and investigative responsibility reflected the complexity of cold case work. Every fact released to the public has consequences, especially when living families remain connected to events that occurred decades earlier. One of the most persistent questions surrounding Joseph's death concerns the complete absence of a missing person report. Throughout the original investigation, detectives repeatedly expressed disbelief that no one had come forward searching for a child matching Joseph's description. That mystery remains unresolved today. Investigators continue asking why there was no documented effort to report him missing. Was he living in circumstances so isolated that his disappearance escaped public notice? Did someone intentionally conceal his existence? Or were there circumstances investigators have not yet been able to fully reconstruct? The available evidence does not answer those questions, and authorities have consistently avoided speculation beyond the facts established during the investigation. What remains certain is that Joseph's disappearance generated none of the immediate concern investigators would ordinarily expect following the unexplained absence of a young child. Equally troubling is the evidence suggesting that Joseph experienced repeated physical abuse before his death. The autopsy documented numerous bruises in different stages of healing, along with older scars on several areas of his body. These findings indicated that at least some injuries predated the fatal head trauma by days or weeks. Investigators have long regarded this pattern as one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case, because it implies that Joseph's suffering may not have begun on the day he died. Yet, even here, important questions remain unanswered. Detectives cannot determine from the available evidence exactly who inflicted those earlier injuries, under what circumstances they occurred, or whether more than one individual may have been involved. The physical evidence documents the existence of the injuries, but cannot reveal the identity of the person responsible. Another enduring mystery involves the care taken with Joseph's body after death. Investigators observed that his hair had been freshly cut, his fingernails neatly trimmed, and his body apparently cleaned before being abandoned in Fox Chase. These observations have remained central to investigative discussions for decades because they appear inconsistent with the brutality of the fatal assault. Detectives have repeatedly suggested that whoever handled Joseph after his death may have known him personally. However, they have always been careful to distinguish between reasonable investigative interpretation and established fact. The condition of the body supports the conclusion that it had been cleaned, but it does not establish why this occurred or what emotional state, if any, motivated the individual responsible. Whether those actions reflected an attempt to remove evidence, conceal identity, or something else entirely remains unknown. The cardboard bassinet box itself continues to symbolize the unresolved nature of the investigation. Detectives successfully traced the box through its manufacturing and distribution process to a J.C. Penney store in the Philadelphia area. Under ordinary circumstances, Such a trace might have identified the purchaser or narrowed the investigation considerably. Instead, the limitations of retail record-keeping during the 1950s prevented investigators from identifying who bought the item. The box, therefore, became both an important clue and a frustrating reminder of how investigative opportunities can be limited by the technology and business practices of a particular era. Had modern purchase records existed in 1957, investigators might have been able to identify the customer within hours. Instead, the cardboard box remained silent, preserving its role as one of the investigation's earliest dead ends. The plaid blanket wrapped around Joseph likewise continues to illustrate the challenge of distinguishing between evidence and coincidence. Experts examined the blanket thoroughly, hoping that its manufacture or design might point toward a particular region, retailer, or household. Instead, they concluded that it was a common mass-produced item widely available throughout the eastern United States. Its ordinary nature prevented investigators from linking it to any specific individual. The blanket undoubtedly accompanied Joseph to the place where his body was abandoned, yet it revealed almost nothing about where he had lived or who had cared for him. Like so many other pieces of evidence in the case, it raised more questions than it answered. Among the many investigative theories considered over the decades, none has been proven sufficiently to resolve the case. The statement provided in 2002 by the woman publicly known as M, or Martha, remains one of the most widely discussed examples. Her account described an adopted boy who was allegedly abused, became ill after eating baked beans, suffered a fatal head injury inflicted by her adoptive mother, and whose body was subsequently washed, groomed, placed inside a cardboard box, and abandoned. Detectives acknowledged that certain details in the statement appeared consistent with known facts surrounding Joseph's death. Nevertheless, consistency alone cannot establish truth. Investigators found no independent physical evidence capable of verifying the account. The alleged adoptive mother had already died, preventing further questioning or corroboration. Without supporting evidence, police declined to identify the statement as the definitive explanation for Joseph's death. Instead, it remains one investigative lead among many, important enough to examine carefully but insufficient to close the case. Another theory suggested that Joseph may have lived outside ordinary public institutions before his death, possibly explaining why no one reported him missing. Some investigators considered whether prolonged isolation or illegal custody arrangements might account for the complete absence of public recognition after his body was discovered. Yet once again, these possibilities remain hypotheses rather than established conclusions. Authorities have consistently emphasized that no evidence conclusively demonstrates Joseph was trafficked or unlawfully transferred between caregivers. Responsible investigation requires distinguishing what evidence proves from what evidence merely allows investigators to consider. This disciplined approach has characterized the case for more than 6 decades and continues today. The absence of an arrest means there has never been a criminal trial connected to Joseph's murder. No suspect has appeared before a jury. No witness has testified regarding the events that ended his life. No court has weighed competing evidence or delivered a verdict. As a result, one section commonly found in the history of major criminal cases, the courtroom proceedings, is absent here. Instead, the investigation itself has become the central narrative, spanning generations of detectives united by a common objective. Their work demonstrates both the remarkable persistence of law enforcement and the limitations imposed by time, technology, and missing evidence. Every generation contributed something to the case, even when immediate success remained elusive. The detectives of 1957 preserved evidence that later generations would analyze using methods unimaginable at the time. Modern forensic scientists restored Joseph's identity through technologies unavailable to their predecessors. Future investigators may yet benefit from additional scientific advances that cannot presently be anticipated. Joseph Augustus Zarelli's story, therefore, remains unfinished. His name has been restored, replacing the heartbreaking title of America's unknown child that defined him for 65 years. His grave now bears his true identity rather than the anonymity forced upon him by history. Yet the central question that began beside Susquehanna Road in February 1957 still awaits an answer. Who was responsible for the repeated abuse documented during his autopsy? Who inflicted the fatal head injury? Who carefully washed and prepared his body before placing it inside a cardboard bassinet box? Who transported that box to the quiet roadside in Fox Chase and left without being seen? And perhaps most painfully of all, how did a little boy disappear so completely from public view that an entire nation spent more than 6 decades searching not only for his killer, but first for his name? Those questions remain open today. The Philadelphia Police Department continues to classify Joseph's death as an unsolved homicide and continues encouraging anyone with relevant information to come forward. While history has finally restored Joseph Augustus Zarelli's identity, justice has yet to catch up with the truth, and until that day arrives, his case will continue to stand as one of the most enduring reminders that every unidentified victim is more than a mystery waiting to be solved. They are a human life waiting to be fully remembered. The story of Joseph Augustus Zarelli does not conclude with an arrest, a courtroom verdict, or a confession that finally explains every unanswered question. Instead, it ends where many of the most difficult cold cases remain, between certainty and uncertainty, between what has finally been discovered and what may never be known. After more than 6 decades, investigators succeeded in restoring one of the most fundamental truths that had been stolen from the little boy found beside Susquehanna Road. They gave him back his name, yet they continue searching for the person who took his life. That contrast has become the defining legacy of the boy in the box case. It is both an extraordinary success in forensic science and one of the oldest unresolved homicide investigations in Philadelphia's history. Looking back across the timeline of the investigation, it becomes clear why this case has occupied such a unique place in American criminal history. The discovery itself was tragic, but sadly, homicide investigations occur in every generation. What transformed this case into something unforgettable was the unprecedented silence surrounding the victim. Detectives expected obstacles. They expected conflicting witness statements, uncertain timelines, and perhaps even a suspect determined to conceal the truth. What they did not expect was that no one would come forward to identify the child. That complete absence of recognition challenged assumptions about how communities function and how children normally exist within society. Most young children leave countless traces behind. They are seen by neighbors playing outside. They accompany parents into stores. They visit doctors for routine examinations. They attend schools, churches, or community gatherings. Family photographs preserve birthdays and holidays. Even when families struggle, children usually remain visible to someone beyond the walls of a single home. Joseph's case appeared to contradict that expectation. Whether because of isolation, neglect, or circumstances investigators have yet to reconstruct, he seemed to disappear from public awareness long before his body was discovered. That reality explains why the case resonated so deeply with the public. It was not only a murder investigation, it became a symbol of a child who appeared to have lived beyond the reach of ordinary protection. The nickname, America's Unknown Child, reflected that painful symbolism. It acknowledged that millions of people had seen his photograph, while no one could speak his name. For 65 years, newspapers, detectives, historians, and ordinary citizens referred to him by a description rather than an identity. The title itself became a reminder that something profoundly important remained missing. When the Philadelphia Police Department announced in December 2022 that the child's name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, the announcement carried emotional significance far beyond the boundaries of forensic science. It represented an act of restoration. A child who had entered history through anonymity finally re-entered it as an individual. The replacement of his gravestone with one bearing his true name reflected that transformation. It was a quiet but meaningful acknowledgement that Joseph would no longer be remembered solely for the circumstances of his death. He would also be remembered as a child who had a birthday, a family name, and a place in history beyond the cardboard box in which he was found. Even so, investigators have repeatedly emphasized that identifying Joseph did not solve his murder. That distinction remains essential. Public attention naturally focused on the dramatic DNA breakthrough, yet detectives immediately reminded the public that the investigation continued. They had answered one question while many others remained unresolved. Who delivered the fatal blow that fractured Joseph's skull? Who was responsible for the older bruises and scars documented during the autopsy? Why had his body apparently been washed and groomed before being abandoned? Why was he wrapped in an ordinary plaid blanket and placed inside a bassinet shipping box? Who transported him to the isolated roadside in Fox Chase? Why was that location selected? And perhaps the most persistent question of all, why did no missing person report ever alert authorities that a little boy had disappeared? These questions continue to define the investigation because they concern accountability rather than identification. Joseph's restored identity allows investigators to ask those questions with greater precision. But the evidence available to answer them remains limited. Authorities have acknowledged that they possess information concerning Joseph's biological family, while also making clear that living relatives deserve privacy and that the investigation remains active. This careful approach reflects the responsibility investigators carry when balancing public interest against fairness and the possibility of future legal proceedings. Throughout the decades, numerous theories have attempted to explain Joseph's final years. Some focused on prolonged abuse within a household. Others considered the possibility that he had lived outside ordinary social institutions, explaining why no one reported him missing. The account provided by the woman identified publicly as M attracted considerable attention, because portions of her statement appeared consistent with known facts surrounding the crime. Yet investigators have consistently resisted the temptation to elevate any theory into an official conclusion without supporting evidence. This discipline is one reason the investigation has retained its credibility despite the passage of time. Detectives have distinguished carefully between evidence, reasonable inference, and speculation. That distinction protects both the integrity of the investigation and the possibility that future discoveries may still reshape understanding of the case. The evolution of forensic science offers another important lesson. In 1957, investigators relied upon fingerprints, witness interviews, medical examination, and traditional detective work. Those methods were employed extensively, yet they could not identify Joseph. Decades later, genetic genealogy accomplished what generations of investigators had believed impossible. This remarkable achievement demonstrates that unanswered cases should not automatically be viewed as unsolvable. Scientific progress continually expands the tools available to investigators. Evidence once considered exhausted may reveal entirely new information when examined through technologies unavailable at the time of the original investigation. Joseph's identification stands as one of the most significant examples of that principle. It illustrates why preserving evidence matters, why cold case units continue reopening decades-old investigations, and why families of unidentified victims often continue hoping long after public attention has faded. At the same time, Joseph's case also reminds us that science has limits. DNA can identify a victim. It can sometimes identify a suspect. It cannot always reconstruct every event that occurred inside a private home decades earlier. Particularly when witnesses are absent, memories have faded, and physical evidence has disappeared. Justice depends not only upon technology, but also upon testimony, documentation, and human choices. Somewhere, At some point in 1957, someone knew exactly what happened to Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Whether that knowledge was shared with others, concealed intentionally, or lost forever remains unknown. The passage of time complicates every unanswered question. Witnesses age, memories fade, documents disappear, potential suspects die. Every year that passes narrows opportunities for direct accountability while increasing the importance of preserving historical truth. Yet investigators continue encouraging members of the public to provide information because even decades-old memories can occasionally reveal overlooked details. Cold cases have been solved through seemingly insignificant recollections, forgotten conversations, or documents discovered years after investigators believed every lead had been exhausted. For that reason, the Philadelphia Police Department continues to classify Joseph's death as an active, unsolved homicide rather than a closed chapter of history. Ultimately, the legacy of Joseph Augustus Zarelli reaches beyond criminal investigation alone. His story has become a reminder of the responsibility society bears toward its most vulnerable members. Every child deserves safety, recognition, and protection. Every victim deserves a name. Every unsolved case represents not merely an unanswered legal question, but an unfinished human story. Joseph's identity has finally been restored, ensuring that future generations will know him by the name given to him at birth rather than by the tragic circumstances of his discovery. That restoration cannot undo the suffering reflected in the injuries documented during his autopsy, nor can it erase the decades during which he remained anonymous. It can, however, ensure that he is remembered as more than a mystery. Today, visitors to his grave no longer see only the title that once defined him as America's unknown child. They see the name Joseph Augustus Zarelli. It is a small inscription carrying enormous meaning. It represents the determination of investigators who refuse to abandon a forgotten child, the extraordinary capabilities of modern forensic science, and the enduring belief that even after many decades, truth remains worth pursuing. The identity of Joseph Augustus Zarelli has been recovered. The search for the person responsible for his death continues. Until that final question is answered, the boy in the box will remain not only one of America's most famous cold cases, but also one of its most enduring reminders that justice is measured not simply by solving crimes, but by refusing to forget those whose voices were taken from them far too soon. For nearly every investigator who worked the case, the most haunting aspect was never simply the brutality of Joseph Augustus Zarelli's death. It was the extraordinary length of time during which he remained unknown. In homicide investigations, a victim's name is often established within hours. Even when identification proves difficult, investigators usually uncover enough records, witness statements, or family connections to restore a person's identity within days or weeks. Joseph's case defied every expectation. From February 1957 until December 2022, he existed in official records as an unidentified child. Entire generations grew up knowing him only as the boy in the box, or America's unknown child. During those 65 years, detectives, forensic specialists, journalists, historians, and members of the public all shared the same hope, that one day the little boy would no longer be remembered for the container in which he was found, but for the life he had lived before his death. The eventual identification through genetic genealogy fulfilled that hope, but it also reminded everyone involved that restoring identity and achieving justice are not always the same accomplishment. The investigation remains open because the central question has never changed: who caused the fatal injuries that ended Joseph's life? The evidence collected in 1957 continues to establish several facts with confidence. Joseph was a young boy approximately 4 to 6 years old. He measured about 1 meter in height and weighed only around 13 kilograms, indicating that he was significantly underweight for a child of his age. His brown hair had recently been cut very short, his fingernails had been neatly trimmed, and his body appeared to have been washed before it was abandoned. Medical examiners documented numerous bruises and scars in different stages of healing, demonstrating that some injuries occurred before the fatal assault. The fatal injury consisted of severe blunt force trauma to the head, producing a catastrophic skull fracture that investigators determined to be the cause of death. At the same time, the examination found no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no evidence of drowning, and no confirmed evidence of sexual assault. Those findings have remained unchanged throughout the decades because they are supported directly by the original medical examination rather than by speculation or later interpretation. Likewise, investigators remain confident regarding the circumstances surrounding the discovery of Joseph's body. He was found inside a cardboard shipping box originally used for a baby bassinet sold through J.C. Penney. The box rested beside Susquehanna Road in the Fox Chase section of Philadelphia, wrapped in an old plaid blanket. Detectives traced the box through manufacturing and distribution channels until they identified the Philadelphia area retail store where it had been sold. Unfortunately, business records from that period did not identify individual purchasers, preventing investigators from determining who had bought the item. Examination of the blanket proved equally inconclusive because it represented a common mass-produced household product widely available throughout the eastern United States. These facts illustrate why the case remains so difficult despite the dedication of generations of investigators. Every promising lead eventually reached the same frustrating conclusion. The evidence pointed toward ordinary objects that could not be connected to a particular individual. Another fact has also remained remarkably consistent across every stage of the investigation. Authorities have repeatedly stated that they continue accepting information from the public. The Philadelphia Police Department has never declared the case closed. Instead, detectives have emphasized that even after Joseph's identification, they continue reviewing new information and encourage anyone possessing relevant knowledge to come forward. This continued commitment reflects an important principle within homicide investigations. The passage of time does not erase the responsibility to pursue justice. Although decades have passed since Joseph's death, investigators understand that new evidence can emerge unexpectedly. A forgotten conversation, an overlooked document, or information shared by someone who previously remained silent may still provide valuable investigative leads. Cold cases around the world have demonstrated that significant breakthroughs sometimes occur many years after the original crime, often through the combination of preserved evidence and renewed investigative effort. Joseph's identification itself stands as proof of that possibility. Had investigators abandoned hope after the first few years, his true name might never have been discovered. Instead, they preserved evidence with extraordinary care, allowing modern forensic science to accomplish what earlier generations could not. The success of the genetic genealogy investigation has therefore become an important example for law enforcement agencies throughout the United States. It demonstrates the long-term value of preserving physical evidence even when immediate analysis appears exhausted. In 1957, no investigator could have predicted the development of mitochondrial DNA analysis, nuclear DNA testing, or genetic genealogy. Nevertheless, because evidence remained carefully preserved, scientists more than 60 years later possessed the material necessary to identify Joseph through techniques unimaginable at the time of his death. This lesson extends far beyond a single investigation. Many unidentified victims and unsolved homicide cases continue benefiting from scientific advances that did not exist when the crimes originally occurred. Joseph's story illustrates how persistence across generations can eventually answer questions once believed impossible to solve. Yet it also demonstrates the limits of forensic science. Technology restored Joseph's identity, but it could not independently reveal every event leading to his death. DNA can establish biological relationships. It cannot always explain human behavior, reconstruct every conversation, or identify every person who witnessed a crime decades earlier. Those unanswered questions remain dependent upon evidence that investigators either have not yet discovered or may never recover. This distinction explains why authorities continue treating the investigation with such caution. Public announcements have focused on verified facts rather than dramatic conclusions. Detectives have consistently avoided accusing individuals without sufficient evidence, even when investigative theories attracted widespread attention. The account provided by the woman known publicly as M remains an example of this careful approach. Although portions of her statement resembled known aspects of the investigation, detectives never presented it as established truth because independent corroboration could not be obtained. Similarly, broader theories concerning prolonged isolation or possible illegal custody arrangements remain possibilities rather than confirmed explanations. Investigators have repeatedly emphasized that theories are useful only when supported by evidence. This disciplined reliance upon verified facts has preserved the credibility of the investigation. Despite decades of public speculation, the case also leaves behind broader questions about society's responsibility toward vulnerable children. Joseph's injuries suggested prolonged hardship before his death. His apparent malnutrition, repeated bruises, and older scars indicate that the fatal assault may not have been the only violence he experienced. Exactly where that abuse occurred and who witnessed it remain unknown. Nevertheless, the case reminds investigators, historians, and the public alike that protecting children depends upon communities recognizing warning signs and ensuring that vulnerable individuals do not disappear unnoticed. Although Joseph's circumstances remain incompletely understood, the investigation has continued emphasizing compassion for the victim rather than fascination with the offender. That perspective has shaped the way the case is remembered today. Instead of celebrating mystery for its own sake, investigators and historians increasingly focus on Joseph himself, a little boy whose identity was lost for 65 years and whose memory now carries his real name. His restored identity has transformed the language surrounding the case. While The Boy in the Box remains the title by which the investigation is historically recognized, official references now identify him correctly as Joseph Augustus Zarelli. This change may appear symbolic, but symbols matter. Names acknowledge humanity. They remind us that every unidentified victim once lived an ordinary life before becoming part of a criminal investigation. Joseph was not born as a mystery. He was born as a child on January 13, 1953. The mystery began only after his death. That distinction is perhaps the most meaningful legacy of the investigation. Even though justice remains incomplete, Joseph no longer exists only as an unidentified victim. His identity has been restored permanently to history. Today, the Philadelphia Police Department continues treating his death as an active homicide investigation. Detectives remain committed to following new information wherever it leads while respecting the privacy of surviving family members and the integrity of the evidence. Their work reflects the belief that no passage of time should diminish the value of a human life or the importance of seeking truth. Whether the remaining questions surrounding Joseph's death are answered tomorrow or many years from now cannot be predicted. What is certain, however, is that his story continues to inspire advances in forensic investigation, renewed commitment to cold case work, and enduring compassion for victims whose voices were taken from them too soon. Joseph Augustus Zarelli entered history as an unknown child discovered inside a cardboard box along a quiet road in Fox Chase. He remains remembered today not because of the mystery alone, but because generations of investigators refused to accept that a little boy could disappear without ever being given back his name. Even as the search for his killer continues, that determination ensures that Joseph's story will endure not simply as one of America's most famous unsolved murders, but as a lasting testament to the pursuit of truth, dignity, and justice. The investigation into Joseph Augustus Zarelli's death has become a story defined by time. Few criminal cases demonstrate so clearly how the passage of decades can transform both the challenges and possibilities of an investigation. When the child was discovered in February 1957, detectives worked with the tools available to them at the time. They relied on interviews, physical evidence, medical examination, public appeals, and traditional police methods. Those methods were applied with determination, but the case remained trapped by one overwhelming obstacle. The victim had no identity. Without knowing who the child was, investigators could not easily locate relatives, determine his history, or understand the circumstances that brought him to Fox Chase. For decades, Joseph's identity remained the missing piece that prevented the investigation from moving forward. The breakthrough in 2022 changed that reality, but it also revealed the complexity of solving a crime that had remained unanswered for so long. Identifying Joseph provided investigators with a foundation they had never possessed before. They could now place a real name on the records, establish his birth date, and understand that the child found in the box was not an anonymous figure, but a person with biological connections and a history. However, the discovery also created new responsibilities. Investigators had to balance the public desire for answers with the privacy of surviving relatives and the requirements of an ongoing homicide investigation. The announcement of Joseph's identity was therefore carefully limited. Authorities confirmed his name and basic information, but withheld additional details about his family. This decision reflected the reality that the investigation had entered a new phase. The question was no longer simply, who was this child? It had become, what happened to Joseph Augustus Zarelli, and who was responsible? Those questions remain at the center of the case. One of the most difficult aspects of the investigation continues to be reconstructing Joseph's life. Before his death, the known facts create a painful outline but leave many important details missing. Joseph was born in West Philadelphia on January 13, 1953. By the time of his death, he was approximately 4 years old. Medical evidence suggested that he had experienced significant hardship before the final injury that killed him. His low body weight indicated possible long-term nutritional problems. The multiple bruises and scars documented during the autopsy suggested repeated physical harm over time. These findings raised serious questions about the environment in which Joseph lived during the months and years before February 1957. Yet investigators still do not know where he spent those years, who provided his daily care, or who was present during the abuse that preceded his death. The absence of those answers remains one of the most painful elements of the case. The investigation has always centered on evidence rather than assumption, and that principle remains especially important when examining Joseph's unknown final months. It is tempting to create a complete narrative from the available clues, but responsible investigators must acknowledge the difference between what is known and what is only possible. The condition of Joseph's body indicates that he suffered before his death. It suggests that someone may have been responsible for his care and may have had access to him over time. However, the evidence does not conclusively reveal the identity of that person or the exact circumstances surrounding his life. Every theory must be measured against the facts that can be verified. This careful approach has prevented the investigation from becoming dominated by speculation. Over the years, many members of the public became emotionally invested in the case. The image of the unidentified child affected people across generations because it represented a fundamental human question. How could a child exist without anyone coming forward to claim him? The public response demonstrated the power of a victim's story even when the victim's identity remained unknown. Thousands of people encountered the photographs and descriptions released by investigators. Many hoped they might recognize the child and provide the answer detectives needed. Yet for 65 years, no identification came. The silence surrounding Joseph became almost as mysterious as the circumstances of his death. The eventual DNA breakthrough showed that the answer had always existed somewhere within his biological history. waiting for technology to become advanced enough to uncover it. The role of genetic genealogy in Joseph's identification represents a major turning point not only in this case, but also in modern criminal investigations. Traditional DNA analysis usually requires a comparison between crime scene evidence and a known individual. Genetic genealogy expanded that possibility by allowing investigators to search for biological relationships through genetic connections. In Joseph's case, this approach required extensive research, careful verification, and the examination of family relationships across generations. The process was not immediate and did not provide investigators with a simple answer. Instead, it gradually narrowed possibilities until researchers could establish Joseph's identity with confidence. The success demonstrated the importance of combining scientific innovation with traditional investigative methods. Technology alone did not solve the case. It required the cooperation of forensic experts, genealogical research, historical records, and careful police investigation. The identification also changed how Joseph would be remembered. For decades, the phrase "the boy in the box" described him only through the circumstances of his discovery. While that name became widely recognized, it also reflected the tragedy that his true identity had been lost. Once investigators announced that he was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, the public understanding of the case shifted. He was no longer simply an unidentified victim from a famous mystery. He was a child with a name, a birthday, and a place in the world. This restoration of identity represented a significant moment of dignity for Joseph and for everyone who had worked to identify him. However, investigators continued emphasizing that the ultimate goal remained justice. A name could not answer every question. It could not identify the person who caused his injuries. It could not explain why his body was clean before being abandoned. It could not reveal why no missing report was filed. It could not determine who placed the cardboard box beside Susquehanna Road. Those questions continue to define the investigation. The unresolved nature of the case also highlights the importance of witnesses. Physical evidence can reveal certain facts, but human testimony often provides the context necessary to understand a crime. Someone may have seen Joseph before his death. Someone may have known where he lived. Someone may have noticed his absence. Someone may possess information that was never shared with authorities. The possibility that such information still exists is one reason investigators continue appealing to the public. Even after many decades, a person who remained silent in 1957 may eventually decide to provide information. Memories may fade, but they can also preserve details that no document recorded. The history of cold case investigations has repeatedly shown that breakthroughs can emerge unexpectedly. The boy in the box case itself is proof of that reality. For 65 years, identification seemed impossible. Then, through advances in forensic science, investigators achieved what earlier generations could not. That achievement provides hope that the remaining questions may one day also be answered. The case of Joseph Augustus Zarelli is not only a story about a crime committed in 1957. It is also a story about persistence, scientific progress, and the refusal to allow a victim to remain forgotten. His name was recovered because investigators continued searching long after many people believed the mystery would never be solved. The same determination now guides the search for accountability. Joseph's story reminds us that every victim represents more than evidence in an investigation. Behind every case file is a human being whose life mattered. Joseph was a child before he became a case. He had a name before he became a mystery. Restoring that truth was an important victory, but the pursuit of justice remains unfinished. Until the person responsible is identified and the full story of Joseph's final days is known, the investigation will continue. The little boy once remembered only as America's unknown child now has a name, but his story still waits for its final answer. The search for justice in the case of Joseph Augustus Zarelli represents one of the longest and most challenging investigations in the history of the Philadelphia Police Department. More than 65 years have passed since the morning when a young boy's body was discovered near Susquehanna Road in Fox Chase. Yet the central mystery remains unresolved. The investigation has traveled through different eras of policing, from handwritten case files and newspaper appeals to modern forensic laboratories and genetic genealogy. Each generation of investigators inherited the same responsibility: to seek answers for a child whose life ended in tragedy and whose identity remained unknown for most of his place in history. The identification of Joseph in 2022 was an extraordinary achievement, but it also reinforced the reality that the most important questions still remained unanswered. Knowing his name revealed who he was. It did not reveal who was responsible for his death. For investigators, that distinction continues to guide the work. The goal is not simply to explain a mystery that has fascinated the public for decades. The goal is to establish the truth through evidence and, ultimately, to seek justice for Joseph Augustus Zarelli. When detectives review the case today, they are confronted by a combination of certainty and uncertainty. Certain facts have remained consistent since the original investigation. Joseph was a young boy between 4 and 6 years old. He had brown hair and blue eyes. He was approximately 1 meter tall and weighed around 13 kilograms. His body showed signs of both recent and older injuries. The fatal trauma was a severe injury to the head caused by significant force. His body had been cleaned, his hair had recently been cut, and his fingernails had been trimmed before he was placed inside the cardboard bassinet box. He was wrapped in a plaid blanket and abandoned in a wooded area of Fox Chase. These facts form the foundation of the investigation. However, the circumstances surrounding them remain unclear. Investigators still do not know exactly when Joseph suffered his fatal injuries. They do not know who was with him at the time. They do not know who prepared his body afterward. They do not know who transported the box to the roadside location. Every unanswered question represents another piece of a story that remains incomplete. The absence of a known suspect has made the case particularly difficult. In many homicide investigations, detectives begin with a relationship between the victim and the offender. They examine family connections, personal conflicts, financial motives, or recent interactions. Joseph's case lacked that starting point for decades because investigators did not even know the victim's identity. Without a name, there was no immediate circle of relatives, friends, or acquaintances to examine. The investigation therefore began with the most basic question possible. Who was this child? The answer required 65 years and the development of technology that did not exist when the crime occurred. Even after Joseph's identification, investigators have remained cautious about publicly discussing specific individuals connected to his background. Authorities have stated that they have information they cannot release because the homicide investigation is still active. Protecting the privacy of surviving family members and avoiding unnecessary harm to individuals who have not been accused of wrongdoing remain important considerations. In a case surrounded by decades of speculation, investigators must carefully separate confirmed information from assumptions. This approach has been consistent throughout the history of the investigation. From the beginning, detectives understood the emotional impact of the case, but refused to allow public pressure to replace evidence. The attention surrounding Joseph's death was enormous. Newspapers throughout the United States reported on the unidentified child. The distribution of hundreds of thousands of flyers demonstrated the scale of the effort to identify him. Authorities hoped that someone would recognize the boy's face, remember a missing child, or provide information that would reveal his background. Yet despite these efforts, the investigation remained at a standstill for decades. The failure to identify Joseph became one of the most troubling aspects of the case because it suggested that his disappearance had gone unnoticed by the people around him. This question continues to trouble investigators today. How could a young child disappear without generating a missing person report? How could a child with relatives, a birthplace, and a recorded existence remain unknown for so long? The answers may lie in circumstances that investigators have not yet uncovered. They may involve isolation, neglect, secrecy, or other factors. But without evidence, these possibilities remain unanswered questions rather than established conclusions. The theory involving the woman known publicly as M, or Martha, continues to be one of the most discussed possibilities connected to Joseph's death. Her account attracted attention because it included several details that appeared consistent with the known evidence. She described a child who was allegedly abused, became ill after eating baked beans, suffered a fatal injury, and whose body was later cleaned and placed inside a cardboard box. The similarities were significant enough that investigators examined the information carefully. However, the investigation requires more than similarities. Without independent evidence confirming the account, authorities could not treat it as the solution to the case. The alleged adoptive mother connected to the story had already died, and other details could not be independently verified. As a result, the account remains part of the investigative history, but not an established explanation for Joseph's death. This careful evaluation demonstrates one of the most important principles in criminal investigation. A theory, no matter how compelling, must ultimately be supported by evidence. The same principle applies to other theories that emerged over the years, including suggestions that Joseph may have lived outside normal social systems or may have been hidden from public view. These ideas attempt to explain why no one reported him missing, but they remain unconfirmed. Investigators have never announced definitive proof that Joseph was involved in illegal custody, arrangements, or child trafficking. The absence of records is itself significant, but it cannot automatically prove why those records do not exist. The search for justice requires patience because the truth must be established through facts, not assumptions. One of the most important lessons from Joseph's case is the value of preserving evidence. When investigators collected evidence in 1957, they could not have predicted that future scientists would be able to analyze DNA in ways that would transform criminal investigations. Yet because evidence was preserved, modern forensic techniques eventually succeeded in identifying him. This achievement provides hope for other unidentified victims and unsolved cases. It demonstrates that time does not necessarily eliminate the possibility of answers. Scientific progress can reopen investigations that once appeared permanently stalled. However, Joseph's case also shows that identification is only one part of justice. The discovery of his name was a major milestone, but it did not erase the suffering he experienced or reveal the person responsible. The investigation continues because every victim deserves more than recognition. They deserve accountability. Joseph's story has become a reminder that justice is not measured only by arrests and convictions. It is also measured by the commitment to remember victims and continue searching for answers when others might give up. For decades, investigators refused to allow Joseph to remain only a photograph, a case number, or a tragic nickname. They continued searching until they could finally say his name. That same determination now guides the search for the person responsible for his death. The road ahead remains uncertain. The passage of more than 6 decades presents undeniable challenges. Potential witnesses may have passed away. Memories may have changed. Evidence may have been lost. Yet history has already shown that unexpected breakthroughs are possible. The identification of Joseph Augustus Zarelli once seemed impossible, but it became reality because investigators continued pursuing the truth. The same possibility exists for the remaining questions surrounding his death. Somewhere within the decades of silence, there may still be information that can explain what happened. Someone may remember something previously considered unimportant. Someone may possess knowledge that was never shared. Someone may hold the final piece needed to complete Joseph's story. Until those answers are found, the investigation will continue. Joseph Augustus Zarelli is no longer America's unknown child. He is a child whose name has been restored and whose memory has been preserved. But the responsibility to him remains unfinished. The search continues not only to solve a crime, but to fulfill a promise made more than 65 years ago, that this child would not be forgotten, and that the truth of what happened to him would continue to be pursued. The case of Joseph Augustus Zarelli stands as a powerful example of how a single investigation can span generations, transform with advances in science, and continue searching for answers long after many believe the truth might never be discovered. For more than 65 years, the child found inside a cardboard bassinet box in Fox Chase existed as a question without an answer. His photograph appeared in newspapers, his reconstructed image was shared across the country, and his story became one of the most recognized mysteries in American criminal history. Yet behind the mystery was a real child whose life had been reduced to a few known facts. A young boy, approximately 4 to 6 years old, discovered alone beside a quiet Philadelphia road, with no confirmed identity and no known person publicly searching for him. The greatest achievement of the investigation came not through the arrest of a suspect or a courtroom verdict, but through the restoration of his identity. In December 2022, the name Joseph Augustus Zarelli replaced the title that had defined him for decades. The unknown child finally became a person again. However, the investigation into his death remains unfinished. His identity was recovered, but the full truth of his final days remains hidden. The story of Joseph begins with a simple but important reminder. Every victim of a crime is first and foremost a human being. Before he became known as the boy in the box, Joseph was a child born on January 13, 1953, in West Philadelphia. He had a family name, he had relatives, he had a place in the world. The tragedy of the case was not only that his life was taken, but that for more than half a century, even his identity was lost. The investigation became a search not only for a killer, but for recognition of the child himself. In 1957, investigators faced an extraordinary challenge. They had a victim but no background information. They had physical evidence but no personal history. They had a crime scene but no witnesses who could explain what had happened. Every traditional path of investigation depended on knowing something about the victim, but Joseph's identity remained unknown. Detectives searched through missing child reports, hospitals, schools, orphanages, adoption records, and countless other possibilities. They distributed hundreds of thousands of flyers and shared information throughout the region and beyond. The effort reflected the belief that someone, somewhere must know who this child was. Yet year after year passed without an answer. The investigation became a symbol of persistence because authorities refused to accept that a child could disappear without a name. The discovery of Joseph's identity through DNA genealogy decades later demonstrated the importance of that persistence. Modern science succeeded where earlier methods could not. The process required advanced DNA analysis, genealogical research, and careful examination of historical records. The breakthrough did not happen because of a single piece of evidence suddenly revealing everything. Instead, it was the result of years of technological development and careful investigative work. Scientists analyzed genetic information from Joseph's remains and traced connections through biological relatives. Researchers examined family relationships and historical documentation until they could confirm his identity. The achievement became one of the most significant examples of how genetic genealogy can transform cold case investigations. It also provided hope for other unidentified victims whose stories remain unresolved. Yet even after Joseph's identity was revealed, investigators continued to face the same difficult reality. The person responsible for his death remained unknown. The evidence continues to tell a tragic story. Joseph's body showed signs of serious harm before his death. The autopsy documented numerous bruises and scars, some old and some recent. His weight suggested possible malnutrition. His head injuries revealed the violence that caused his death. These facts indicate that Joseph suffered before the final moment of his life. However, they do not provide every answer investigators need. They do not identify who caused those injuries. They do not reveal where the abuse occurred. They do not explain who was responsible for caring for him. They do not tell investigators why nobody reported him missing. These unanswered questions remain at the center of the investigation. The circumstances surrounding Joseph's body have also continued to raise important questions. Investigators noted that he had been cleaned before being abandoned. His hair had been cut. His fingernails had been trimmed. His body had been prepared in a way that suggested deliberate handling after death. These details have influenced investigative theories for decades, including the possibility that the person responsible knew Joseph personally. However, investigators have remained cautious. The evidence shows that the body was cleaned and prepared, but it does not conclusively reveal the reason or the relationship between Joseph and the person who handled him afterward. Responsible investigation requires acknowledging those limits. The same caution applies to the various theories developed throughout the years. The statement from the woman known publicly as M or Martha remains one of the most discussed possibilities because some elements of her account appeared consistent with known facts. However, investigators could not confirm the story through independent evidence. Without verification, it remains only a theory. Other possibilities, including the idea that Joseph may have lived in isolation or outside normal systems of identification, also remain unproven. The investigation continues to follow evidence rather than assumptions. This approach is essential because the goal is not simply to provide an explanation that feels satisfying. The goal is to establish what truly happened to Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The absence of a criminal trial remains one of the defining characteristics of the case. Unlike many famous homicide investigations, there has been no courtroom where evidence was presented, witnesses testified, and a jury determined responsibility. There has been no final legal conclusion. The case remains an open investigation because authorities have not identified a person who can be charged with Joseph's death. This absence of a trial does not mean the investigation has failed. In many ways, the continued search demonstrates the opposite. The case has survived because investigators, forensic experts, and members of the public have continued believing that answers are still possible. Joseph's story also carries an important message about the role of time in criminal investigations. Time can make cases more difficult. Memories fade. Records disappear. People who may have information may no longer be available. Yet time does not always destroy the possibility of justice. Joseph's identification after 65 years proves that unanswered questions can still find answers. It shows the importance of preserving evidence and continuing investigative efforts even when immédiate solution apparaît impossible. The same principle now applies to the search for the person responsible for his death. The future of the investigation remains uncertain, but uncertainty does not mean the search has ended. The Philadelphia Police Department continues to consider Joseph's death an active homicide investigation. Authorities continue encouraging anyone with information to come forward. A single detail, a forgotten memory, or a previously unknown connection could potentially change the direction of the case. Many cold cases have been solved because someone eventually decided to share information they had kept private for years. The possibility of such a breakthrough remains one of the reasons investigators continue their work. Ultimately, the legacy of Joseph Augustus Zarelli is not defined only by the mystery surrounding his death. It is also defined by the determination to remember him. For decades, he was known as America's unknown child because the world did not know his name. Today, his name is known. His story has been restored. His grave carries the identity that belonged to him from birth. That achievement represents a form of justice, even though the larger pursuit continues. Joseph is no longer simply an unidentified child found in a box. He is Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a child whose life mattered and whose memory continues to inspire efforts to discover the truth. The final chapter of his story has not yet been written. The person responsible for his death has not been identified. The circumstances of his final days remain unanswered. But the investigation continues with the same purpose that has guided it from the beginning: to seek truth, to honor the victim, and to ensure that Joseph Augustus Sorelli is never forgotten. More than 6 decades after his discovery, the little boy who once had no name finally has won. And with that name comes a promise that his story will continue to be told until the remaining questions are answered and justice is finally achieved.